Hashem ki tov ki li'olam hasdo ya 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 da di da 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 ya da da hoidul Adonai ki tov ki li'olam hasdo. Everything okay? Yes. Give thanks to God, for He is good. His kindness is forever. That song is Thank You Hashem by Joey Newcomb, featuring our very own Moshe Storch. How are you, my holy sisters and brothers? Let's light up the darkness. Who is with us? Today we got some beautiful, beautiful teachings, both from the Torah and the Talmud. Sometimes, we run into some dry, difficult teachings, and some days we just get a whole bunch of really good ones that are interesting in and of themselves and teach us good lessons for modern times. Okay, I was going to mention this in a moment. I might as well mention it now. Steve Ribbich just put that link in. Okay, so tonight is Lag BaOmer. That's the 33rd day of the Omer. Lag from Lamed Gimel, 33. In the 50-day count that we count from the second day of Passover till the 50th day to Shavuos. And this is a time of really refining our character, elevating ourselves, testing every aspect of our person and personality, to see where we could do better, perhaps work on what we, chose to work on at Passover, a personal pharaoh that we want to free ourselves from. So we're in this period. And it was during the Omer counting period that there was a great plague in the times of the Mishna. Rabbi Akiva's students, he had thousands of students, and a plague decimated them. And the plague finally ended on this day, the 30th, well, that's tonight. It already started in Israel. It's tonight here in LA. It's still daytime here. But the plague ended on the 33rd day of the Omer. Also associated with the Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who is really the founder of Jewish mysticism, as it were. And perhaps his merit helped stem that plague. So the 33rd day of the Omer is a time of great celebration. We've been avoiding listening to live music for these first 33 days of the Omer. And then there's big celebrations on Lag BaOmer. And the biggest is by the grave of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in Israel, in Meron. Last year, they couldn't do it because of COVID. This year, they're back full force. I mean, thousands and thousands of people, singing and dancing there in Meron. There's always a big bonfire associated with that. The news came in just, I think, a couple hours ago that there was a real, I'm not going to say tragedy yet, because it seems like no one was killed, thank God. But it was a horror show. Basically, there was it's extremely crowded there, and there was some kind of a problem with the crowd flowing from one place to another. And there was just like a mob of people pressed into a small area that couldn't accommodate that many people. There was a stampede, and a lot of people were injured. I think the paramedics treated like 50 people. It seems like people are going to recover, but there's at least one gentleman who's in his 80s who is in critical condition. And so we pray. Something up?
Did you hear what happened in Meron?
Yeah, I'm talking about it right now.
Very bad. Very, very bad.
I know. I'm talking about, no one died?
A lot of people died.
They died?
Yes.
Are you sure there's deaths?
100% positive.
Oh, so that didn't come in before.
Yes.
All right.
It was a stampede.
I know about the stampede. So you're telling me people died? Because I didn't read that up until...
That's what I just read.
Okay. So Nina's telling me people died. Terrible. All right. So, I mean, I don't know what to say. I mean, it's such a simcha, such a time of joy to have this stampede, and it's just so marred with tragedy. Okay, so people did die. May their neshamas have a great aliyah. May their memories always be for a blessing. The people who are injured, may God give them a healing. And we say amen. And may we never see this kind of tragedy, this kind of stampede again. And we say amen to that. All right, let's try to shift gears. Who is with us tonight as we do some beautiful learning? It's not quite Lag BaOmer. It's coming in here in LA in a couple hours. But Yehudit in Florence, South Carolina, James in Indianapolis, Rebecca in LA, Melissa in Great Neck, Paula in Chicago, Pauline in Arkansas, Carol in Cleveland, Gwen in Michigan, Patricia loves the music. Thank you, Hashem. PK in Colorado, Sharon in New Jersey, Pauline also loves the music, Randy in Florida, Jose in Miami Lakes. Patricia, you got the answer. That was Joey Newcomb saying thank you Hashem with Moshe Storch. Stephen in Aruba. I was in Aruba more than 30 years ago. It's beautiful there. Lucy in Minnesota. Nancy in North Carolina. Guy in Ohio. There's that link to what's going on in Meron. I didn't realize people died. I'm so sad to hear that. Okay, Anne in Merced, Loretta and Harold, I believe, are in Oregon. Paul in the Great Northwest. Oh my God, 38 people dead. Oh. I don't know what to say. We're dedicating our learning tonight to all those whose lives were tragically cut short in Meron, and may our learning and the merit of our learning be of some assistance to them in the next world. Just so sorry to hear that. Okay. Over there on the YouTube side, Lynn in North Texas and Gigi in British Columbia. All right. We got to shift gears. Believe me, the people who are in Meron respect and love Torah and Torah learning. And the fact that we're learning in their honor is exactly what they would want to do, what they would want us to do for them. If we hear about some kind of a fund set up for the families of the victims, we'll share that and let you know so that we can all donate to that. Terrible to hear. It's such a moment of celebration. Okay. Something that's going to come up in our daf today, really, I mean, we have a fascinating page of the Talmud, as befitting page 18 of Tractate Yoma. But a thought that's going to come up is that the ordinary priests elevate the high priest in their midst. And we're going to talk about what that means, right? So you might think that the ordinary priests would be jealous of the high priest, right? Were Aaron's sons jealous of him? There's actually a midrash that the two sons who died, Nadav and Avihu, at some point one of them said to the other about Moses and Aaron, when are these two old men gonna leave this world so that we can have the authority? That's not in the Torah. That's a midrash. So I don't know how authoritative that midrash is. But generally speaking, probably in the history of the priests serving in the temple, some were jealous of the high priests who were elevated, particularly in the Second Temple period, which is a much more corrupt time than the First Temple period. But certainly the attitude that they at least tried to cultivate among themselves was one of great joy for the one who was elevated as the high priest. And in fact, they all contribute to that joy. So what they don't do is covet his position. That is considered an absolute no-no among the priests. Now, do not covet. That's the 10th commandment. And what's interesting about a commandment which says do not covet, there's very few commandments in the Torah that are internal, that are about feelings. I mean, we've seen one, don't hate your fellow in your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. So those are about feelings, but generally what they mean is action, right? It's like what actions you should take because you're cultivating that feeling. Do not covet. Now, God told Moses to tell us in the Torah, it was one of the 10 Commandments, so right there at the top of the list, do not covet what belongs to others. You cannot be a mensch, right? A mensch, that's a Yiddish word that means a highly, refined and developed and evolved human being. And you cannot be a mensch if you covet what belongs to other people. Now, I have my own problems. I definitely have, particular other commandments that I have to struggle with like everybody else. I'm blessed that this is not one of them for me. I don't know why. Just from a young age, I might see that, a wealthy person or somebody who's lucky enough to own a good object, I might look at that and say, oh, I want one of those, right? But that would just inspire me to work hard and to save up money and to get that particular object that I saw that somebody was enjoying. What it doesn't occur to me is to say, I want what he has, and he shouldn't have it. I want to take it from him. Whenever I see success stories, I enjoy biographies and biographic movies where people are very successful, because to me that says, okay, it's possible to become successful, and something that you strive to do, that you want to work hard in this world to achieve. When you see somebody else did it and took those steps, so that's inspiring. You can do it too. And it just doesn't occur to me to think I want to knock him off his pedestal and take his spot or take what he has. But a lot of people do feel that way, and the Torah mandates about it strictly. You cannot do that. It's at the level of the 10 Commandments, right? And so Rabbi Telushkin, talking in his book, the Jewish Wisdom, says that, it is not wrong to want more than what you now have, but it is altogether wrong to desire it at your neighbor's expense. And then he gives two examples of kings of Israel who coveted and the disasters that led to, right? So one is King David. I mean, he's the holy King David. He's, an absolute hero of the Jewish people. But he was admonished by the prophet Nathan. Why? Because David coveted Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah. And as a result, he soon violated two other of the 10 Commandments. He committed adultery with her. And when she became pregnant, he had her husband killed to cover up the potential scandal. That's murder. More than a century later, King Ahab coveted the vineyard of a man named Naboth. When Naboth refused to sell Ahab the land, the king went into a deep depression. His wife, Queen Jezebel, resolved to acquire the land for him by any means necessary. She arranged for false witnesses to testify that Naboth had committed treason, which led to his execution, whereupon the king took possession of the field. Thus, what started with coveting ended up with violation of 3 of the 10 Commandments. The 9th commandment, which forbids bearing false testimony, the 6th, which prohibits murder, and the 8th, which forbids stealing. A person cannot be a mensch unless he or she learns to control covetous impulses. One must remind oneself constantly that what belongs to another person is forbidden to him or her. The only attitude we should have with respect to successful people is God bless them. That's so nice that they earned that. If they stole it, then, may God be, exact justice from them. But what we should never do is think that person has something, I want to take it from him. And that actually happened to an astonishing degree. There was a true story. They made a movie about it called Pain and Gain. but it was a true story about the Sun Gym gang. This was in the 90s in Miami. It was a bunch of trainers, like musclehead personal trainers in a gym who got hooked on, motivational speakers who said, are you going to be a doer or a don'ter? Be a doer. You want to go out and take it. You want to be a successful, prosperous person. Make it happen. And the way they interpreted that was they found a rich guy and they kidnapped him and tortured him and forced him to sign documents to sign over all of his wealth to them. Like somehow they deserved it because they took the initiative to kidnap and torture him. I mean, people can go insane based on coveting, right? So if you find yourself coveting, that should be a strong signal to you that you need to refine your character, okay? All right, let's get into our daf. This is Yud Ches. Page 18, right? It's made of the letters Ches and Yud, which is Chai, when spelled backwards, life. So, we always expect something good to happen on something numbered 18, and indeed it is. So we are in Tractate Yoma, the 6th volume of the Talmud. Here on page 18, we're in chapter 1, and today we're discussing the 3rd Mishnah of chapter 1. Generally speaking, we're talking about the preparation of the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, when the temple was standing, the tabernacle, the first temple, and the second temple. They would prepare the high priest for a week, putting him in seclusion in the temple itself, and so that he would be fully ready. He would be shielded from becoming ritually impure, which would disqualify him from the service of Yom Kippur, and they would prepare him. They would sanctify him. He's going to have an encounter with the divine presence in the Holy of Holies. He has to be prepared for that. And he's going to be performing the avodah, all of the divine service normally assigned to different priests of the daily offerings are all going to be brought by the high priest on Yom Kippur, and he's going to bring the special offerings of Yom Kippur, and he has a lot of work to do on that day. So they're going to go over with him for this week in the temple all the different things that he's got to do, the choreography of his day, so he's fully prepared. Here's the 3rd Mishnah. The sages provided the high priest with elders, selected from the elders of the court, and they would read before him the order of the service of the day of Yom Kippur. And they would say to him, "My master, high priest, read the order of the service with your own mouth, as perhaps you forgot this reading, or perhaps you did not learn to read it. On Yom Kippur, on Yom Kippur Eve, meaning Erev Yom Kippur. So that's not the night before the day of Yom Kippur, because the night is when all Hebrew days begin on the night before. Erev Yom Kippur, right, is the full day before. So the night before the night before, or the night before the night of Yom Kippur, and that full day before. So on Yom Kippur Eve, on Erev Yom Kippur in the morning, the elders stand him at the eastern gate of the courtyard, and they pass before him bulls and rams and sheep, so that he will be familiar with the animals and grow accustomed to the service, as these were the animals sacrificed on Yom Kippur. Throughout all the 7 days that the high priest was in the chamber of Parhedron, right, the Parhedron chambers where he was secluded for the 7 days, they would not withhold from him any food or drink that he desired. He ate great for that week while he was preparing. However, on Erev Yom Kippur at nightfall, right? So if Yom Kippur begins, let's say on a Thursday night, and then it's Thursday night and all of Friday, so then on Wednesday night is what we're talking about, they would not allow him to eat a great deal because food induces sleep. And they did not allow him to sleep, as will be explained. So the night before Yom Kippur, if Yom Kippur is a Thursday night and Friday day, Wednesday night, they keep him up all night, right? So he doesn't sleep the night before he's going to enter into that whole 25 hours of service. But wasn't it taught in a Baraisa that it stated, and the Gemara wonders about the depiction in the Mishnah of the elders questioning the high priest as to whether he forgot this reading or perhaps did not learn to read. Granted, perhaps he forgot. That is fine. Perhaps he studied these laws at one time, what a high priest does at Yom Kippur, and he forgot. He didn't study them in great enough detail, and he's not familiar enough. It's not right on the tip of his tongue, everything that he's got to do. Okay. But how is it possible that a man who could become the high priest of Israel would be illiterate? That he never learned to read? I mean, that's just inconceivable. Perhaps that he's never read the Torah, that he hasn't learned these laws ever? How is that possible? How could he rise to such a station in the old days, they memorized the entire Torah. And now you're telling me that this is a guy who never read the Torah? How could such a man be the high priest? Do we appoint a high priest of that sort who never learned the Bible? But wasn't it taught in a Baraisa that it is stated, and the priest who is greater than his brethren. Now this is Leviticus 21:10. And the priest who is greater than his brethren. Now this phrase generally just means the high priest, right? The anointed one, the one who serves over the ordinary priest because he's been elevated to be the high priest. However, the sages are going to make more of this verse. This teaches that he must be greater than his brethren before he becomes the high priest. He must be greater than his priestly brethren in strength, in beauty, in wisdom, and in wealth, right? He must be elevated above them in every way, right? And remember that we've already seen that a priest who has a physical blemish is not allowed to bring sacrifices on the altar. There's something about that service that, unless all of Israel has a blemish and there's just no priest who's unblemished, okay, that's a different matter. But since they have the ability to, pick and choose who's going to perform these services, they want to do it in the most beautiful way possible. It's absolutely, something that we do to beautify a mitzvah. So if it's possible to have, somebody who's just great in stature, who's handsome, who's wise, who is strong, and interestingly, who is wealthy. And wealth actually is also associated with prophets. Prophets were generally wealthy men as well. One of the reasons is that they have the time to dedicate themselves to Torah much more and are not so busy earning a living. Another is that they some kind of a blessing has been on them, and that's why they became wealthy. However, it's possible that a high priest could be chosen who is not already wealthy. And that's what we're going to deal with here. Acherim say, others say, now we've learned earlier that this usually refers to Rabbi Meir, wealth is not a prerequisite for selecting a high priest. But from where is it derived that if he does not have property of his own, that his brethren, the priests, elevate him and render him wealthy from their own property? The verse states, and the priest who is greater, Hagadol, than his brethren, elevate him, Gadalehu, from the property of his brethren. In any event, there is a consensus that wisdom is a prerequisite for his selection. So this teaching is being brought to show that, of course, he's a wise man who became the high priest. Why would we suspect that he's never learned the Bible? That's crazy. But in passing, we also learn that when a high priest was appointed, if he wasn't a wealthy man, now they could apply to the king for this, right? Or they could apply to the nation. Or they could say, well, if it's a prerequisite that the high priest is wealthy, there's a huge collection in the temple treasury that comes in from all the half shekels of the population. We could take money from there and elevate the high priest and make sure that, he's not going to be worried about income and he can just focus on his service as high priest. But no, it's not done that way. The other priests elevate him in wealth from their own possessions. Very interesting. Just the opposite of coveting. If they resent that they have to give their money to him once he becomes high priest, that's on them. That's their problem. They should not be resentful. They should enjoy all of them contribute and make sure that he has the status befitting of the high priest. Rav Yosef said, on this question of, okay, is it possible that he hasn't learned these laws ever, right? So that's when they say to him, when they're teaching him during the 7 days, just in case you forgot or you never learned these laws. And we're saying, how's it possible he never learned? So Rav Yosef said, this is not difficult. There, the Baraisa that lists wisdom among the attributes of the high priest is referring to the first temple period. As we learned, during the first temple period, 400 plus years, there were only 18 high priests. They were utterly distinguished men, great sages in their own right, righteous all the way, and that's why they merited to have long lives and long tenures as the high priest, only 18 in 400 years. But the second temple period was not like that. In the second temple period, there were 300 high priests in a period of approximately the same amount of time, 400 plus years. And that's because a lot of corruption entered the system, as it were. And there were high priests who bribed their way and just used corrupt means to get appointed high priest by the king. The whole thing was, it was ugly. It was not good. And I imagine that they knew that if they entered the Holy of Holies, having attained their position through corruption, that they might die in there, and probably they retired, before Yom Kippur. Anyway, we're not talking about that right now. But Rav Yosef is saying that in terms of you can count on a high priest to be wise, we can only count on that in the first temple period. But here, the Mishna is referring to the second temple, where this law was not observed. So a situation where the high priest was not well versed in the Bible was conceivable. As Rav Asi said, the wealthy Marta, daughter of Baitos, brought a half sa of dinars to King Yanai for the fact that he appointed Yehoshua ben Gamla as high priest. This is an example of the appointment of high priests by means of bribery and gifts. Since that was the practice, a totally ignorant high priest could have been appointed. A tragedy indeed. It was taught in the Mishnah on Erev Yom Kippur, in the morning, the elders passed different animals before the high priest. A Tana, a rabbi of the Mishnah, taught in the Tosefta, so teachings of the Mishnaic period, but with a little bit of commentary added. Even goats were brought before him. And the Gemara asks, and the Tana of our Mishnah, who says that on the morning before Yom Kippur, they pass the animals that he's going to be involved with the next day during Yom Kippur. They pass those animals before him, right? A ram, a sheep, and a bull. And the question is, why not a goat, right? Because for sure, the goats are involved on Yom Kippur. There are 2 goats. They're chosen by lot. One is sacrificed in the temple. The other one is sent out into the wilderness and given to Azazel, which we'll talk about in a moment. So the Tana of our Mishnah, what is the reason that he did not teach that goats were among the animals that passed before the high priest? And the Gemara answers, since goats come as an atonement for sins, passing them before the high priest will evoke transgressions and he will become distraught. They want to keep him in a very positive, a studious, but a positive frame of mind. And passing these goats before him might distress him. Why? Because it might suggest to him his own sins, that he's going to, and he will tremble, thinking that, am I pure enough? Have I atoned enough for my own sins so that I can enter the Holy of Holies? But if that's the case, well, the bull that the high priest brings as an offering on Yom Kippur is meant as an atonement for himself, and for his household, and for his fellow priests. So if there's a concern about, his sins coming into his consciousness and distressing him, well, the bull would do that, more than the goats even. So that's not the reason. So we have a suggestion from that Rav Steinsaltz brings down from the commentator, the Meiri, and he explains that the Gemara is alluding to a belief in theological dualism, which was widespread in the Talmudic era. So what is this about? Those 2 goats, there's 2 of them, right? One goat is sacrificed in the temple as an offering to the Most High, to God. Another goat, called the scapegoat, right? The high priest puts his hands on it and recites he recites a set piece from the Torah that essentially says that the sins of the people are on the head of this goat, and now we send it out to Azazel. Azazel, right? Which in an English translation is always capitalized. So what is Azazel? Some people will say, who is Azazel? But Azazel is not a who. First of all, heaven forbid we should ever imagine that there's some kind of deity that, is some kind of like powerful being apart from God. There is only God. We're in God. This whole universe is in God. There's nothing comparable to God in any way. There's no, supernatural force that opposes God in God's world. That is an un-Jewish thought. Azazel is a place. Azazel is a cliff, a mountain and a cliff where the goat that's sent off into the wilderness is taken, usually by a priest, and it would be taken out through an elaborate procedure, which we're going to come to later in the tractate. And then the red string is tied to its horns. The other end of the red string is tied to a rock. And this priest who takes it out to the wilderness throws that goat off a cliff. It is also sacrificed, but it's sacrificed in a different way. It's a very, very high cliff. It kills the goat. And it takes our sins with it, right? And if our atonement on Yom Kippur, and all of the people are fasting and afflicting themselves, and if the atonement of the nation on Yom Kippur is accepted by God in heaven, then that red string, the end of it, which is still attached to a rock at the top of the cliff, turns white, signaling to the people their atonement has been accepted. And there was a system of communication from that cliff all the way back to the temple. You can imagine like sort of people raising flags, like, spaced out, every 100 yards or so they could see each other, and the flags go up, and very quickly the signal gets all the way back to the temple, and then the high priest continues doing what he's doing in the high temple. But there were people who came to think, okay, well, the goat is being sent to Azazel, and that's a place, but it's a scary, forlorn, desolate place in the wilderness. And the Talmud certainly does have teachings about demons, right? Demons are not, they're not like big, powerful beings that would ever have a chance, against angels and God, but they can hurt us, right? And some of the Jewish teachings on demonology is that we create demons, right? It's like when we sin, we actually create a kind of, a dark force in the world because of our actions, right? In the same way that when we do mitzvahs, when we fulfill our obligations and do what God said to us, an angel is created who advocates for us in the heavenly court. So some people came to, associate Azazel with some kind of a dark force, a demonic force. And it's like the goat being sent out there is somehow placating this force. That is erroneous. That is a false teaching. That is all wrong, right? But it didn't stop a lot of people from having those kinds of thoughts. And so, lest the high priest be one who, was given to those kinds of superstitions, that might be another reason why they don't pass the goats before him. And yet another reason, much more practical, is given. They don't need to pass a goat before him because the way the goats are treated is sort of covered in the extensive liturgy that they read. And I guess they don't want to present the goats to him because they're going to be selected by lot, etc. At any rate, when they present to him the animals that are going to be in use the next day on Yom Kippur, they don't present the goats to him. And the Gemara asks, if so, that the goats would be distressing to him, a bull should not be passed before him, as it too comes to atone for sin. And the Gemara answers that there is a difference in the case of a bull, since it is to atone for his sins and for the sins of his brethren, the priests, that the bull comes. Among his brethren, the priests, if there is a person who has a sinful matter, the high priest would know about it already, and would work to lead his fellow priest back to the path of righteousness through teshuvah, through repentance and atonement. Therefore, passing a bull before the high priest will not render him distressed, as it will merely remind him of his responsibility toward his brethren, the ordinary priests. On the other hand, with regard to the entire Jewish people, he does not know of their sinful matters and is unable to facilitate their repentance. Passing goats before the high priest will evoke the sins of the population, as well as his inability to correct the situation, leaving him distraught. And this makes sense if we're talking about the Second Temple period, because eventually the sins of the population became so great, right, that the Second Temple was destroyed and it was never rebuilt. And the whole land of Israel and the whole temple as our centerpiece, like it fell, to the oppression of the Romans. And that, the writing was on the wall, as it were, for, quite a while, many years before the destruction actually happened. So these high priests in the late Second Temple period, they could see that the land had become filled with lewdness and evil and wickedness, and the spiritual state of the people was just lower and lower and lower every year. And eventually it became irrecoverable, and the temple was destroyed. And the project of the kingdom of Judea, the kingdom of Israel, already it ended, when it fell to Nebuchadnezzar in the first temple period, but at least they rebuilt the second temple. We had somewhat of autonomy in our land. Eventually we had that revolt against the Syrian Greeks, and the Hasmonean dynasty stepped in. So we had times of greater elevation, but eventually it just slipped and slipped and slipped. And for the last 40 years of the second temple period, when they would take the goat out to the wilderness to be thrown off the cliff, and they would tie that red string to its horns and the other end to the rock, for the last 40 years, it never turned white, right? So that idea of the acceptance of our atonement, it didn't happen. It didn't happen. The people had fallen so low, and it was just a matter of time before the kingdom would be destroyed. Apropos the high priest being privy to the sinful behavior of his fellow priests, Ravina said that this explains the folk saying that people say, if the beloved son of your beloved sister becomes a policeman, see to it that in the marketplace you do not pass before him. Be wary of him because he knows your sins. Right? It's so great. That is practical advice. So this idea that, what goes on inside a home is known to the inhabitants of the home, right? So somebody who's not your immediate family, but close, like a nephew, but he knows what's really going on with you, and then he becomes a cop, keep a certain distance because he knows what's really going on with you. And if for some reason he gets angry with you and wants to, sort of focus the heavy hand of the criminal justice system in your direction, nothing good can come of that. Right? So if your nephew becomes a cop, keep a distance, teaches Ravina. But bringing down a folk saying. We continue. We learned in the Mishna, throughout all the 7 days that the high priest was in the Parhedron chamber, they would not withhold from him any food or drink that he desired. It was taught in a Baraisa. Rabbi Yehuda ben Nekosa says, on Yom Kippur Eve, they feed him fine flour and eggs in order to loosen his digestive tract so he can eliminate solid waste, so that he will not have to relieve himself on Yom Kippur. They said to Rabbi Yehuda ben Nekosa, in feeding him those foods, all the more so you bring him to a state of arousal. Meaning, feeding him those foods that would be good for his digestion so that he won't have to, go number 2 on Yom Kippur Day. But those same foods might lead him to have a nighttime seminal emission. And that could render him impure. And we're trying to keep him away from having that occurrence during these 7 days. And that would be antithetical to the efforts to prevent the high priest from becoming impure, as those foods are liable to cause him to experience a seminal emission. It was taught in a Baraisa that Sumakos said in the name of Rabbi Meir, one does not feed him foods represented by the acrostic Aleph, Base, Yud. And some say one does not feed him foods represented by Aleph, Base, Yud. And some say neither does one, and also we don't feed him white wine. And the Gemara elaborates, not Aleph, Base, Yud means not an esrog, right, the citron that we use in our observance of Sukkot, but you can also eat them. It's lemon-like fruit. So you don't feed him an esrog. nor beitzim, eggs. You don't feed him eggs. Nor old wine, yayin. And some say not aleph base yud, neither the esrog, nor the eggs, nor fatty meat, basar, nor old wine, yayin. And some say neither does one feed him white wine, because white wine brings a man to the impurity of the seminal emission. Let me just make a quick adjustment here. Okay. And so you avoid those foods if you want to keep the priest, in other words, the important thing for us is that during that 7 days of preparation, they're preparing his mind, they're preparing his heart, and they're preparing his body, right? In terms of what he's got to be really ready on the day. It's like a marathoner running the course. He's got so much to do on that day. He just has to be fully prepared, mentally, emotionally, physically. Rav Giddel said that Rav said, and I'm almost done, so if you got questions, get them in. Rav Giddel said that Rav said a guest should neither eat eggs because they lead to seminal emission, nor sleep in a garment belonging to the homeowner, his host, because if he experiences a seminal emission and it gets on the garment, he will be diminished in the estimation of his host. Apropos conduct of a guest, the Gemara relates when Rav would happen to come to Darshish. So now we're on a digression, right? Just in terms of how a guest should behave, or a conduct of a guest. So when Rav would happen to come to Darshish, he would declare, "Who will be married to me for the day that I am here, so that I will not be unwed in this place, after which I will divorce her." Similarly, when Rav Nachman would come to Sekansiv, he would declare, "Who will be married to me for the day that I am here?" And we're like, what? What is going on? These are great, great sages, Rav and Rav Nachman. And they're on the road, like they're going to go give a Torah lecture in another city. And so they're not traveling with their own wives. And this is in a time when a man could have more than one wife. But while he's visiting this town, so he's going to marry and divorce a local woman so that while he's in town, the people will see that he's a married man and in the company of his wife. Why is that so important that they would go through this weird device of marrying and divorcing in one day? Moreover, wasn't it taught in a baraisa that Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov says a man should not marry a woman in one state and go and marry a woman in a different state, lest a match be arranged between the child of this wife and the child of that wife? If these guys are having these temporary marriages and they consummate them, it might happen that while he's on the road, he ends up leaving this woman behind and she gets pregnant and then has a child. And then he goes back to his own family and his own wife and he has children there. And unbeknownst to the two families, the children of these two families that don't even know they're related could end up growing up and being matched together and get married. And they're not permitted to each other. They're children of the same father. So it's absolutely prohibited for them to marry. And if they do marry and produce children, those children are mamzerim. A mamzer, it's a kind of a bastard, which it's the child of a prohibited union. Very, very difficult situation. The children of prohibited unions are, just prohibited to join the Jewish community in every way. You can never marry the child of a prohibited union. It's not his fault. It's not her fault. It's not the child's fault. And yet they attain that status in the ancient world. And so concerning this, it is stated, and the land became filled with lewdness, that these kinds of things would happen, men fathering children all over the place, and then those children unknowingly get together. Terrible state of affairs. So how could you allow these sages, how could these sages allow themselves to go have these, temporary marriages just so that they would be a married man when they're in that locality? And the sages say in response, the sages generate publicity. Since they are well known, the identity of their children was also undoubtedly known. Therefore, there was no concern that errors of this kind would befall their children. Okay, so we don't have to worry about that, but it still doesn't explain why they felt they needed to do this in the first place. Some explain that the men in the locations mentioned here, when they went to give a lecture in these particular towns, they were going to a place where the spiritual level was way, way down. And the men of the town did not take their obligations as Jewish men seriously. And particularly, they didn't take their obligation to marry seriously, and they would postpone getting married. Therefore, in order to serve as role models and impress upon them the significance of marriage, Rav and Rav Nachman were reluctant to remain there even briefly without a wife. Others explain that since the residents of that town were cynics, quick to disparage others, the sages arranged to be married so that the residents would not spread rumors about them that while they're on the road, they might be having affairs or something. So they let it be known that they came to this town and they married this local woman. Then there's a whole other issue that when you marry, like you can't marry and consummate the marriage on the same day of the engagement, right? You can't like meet the woman that day and sleep with her, right? You have to. That's the first time you meet her. You could become betrothed that day, but you couldn't consummate the union until 7 days later for issues of purity. So how could these sages arrive in town having prearranged, to marry this woman? And the answer is it was prearranged. So in terms of the matters of purity, that would have been attended to and handled. Still, a very strange kind of cryptic practice that these rabbis had in that time. It's almost like there's details that were missing, and if we understood better what the situation really was and what they were trying to protect against and what they were trying to exemplify and teach to the people, if we had more details, it would probably make more sense to us. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. Let me check your comments and questions. I believe I'm going to need to scan myself because Nina is at our son's baseball game. Okay, yeah, so she is gone. So let me scan the questions. It's just going to take me a moment. Carolyn, the desert conjures up the wilderness wanderings. It also reminds me of Hagar. So she was the maid of Sarah, whom Sarah gave to Abraham because Sarah was childless. And Sarah thought, well, maybe she should just give her maidservant to Abraham. And then the child born of that union, it would be like a surrogate mother, but Sarah would really be the mother. It didn't work out well. Hagar bore Ishmael, and then she sort of looked down a little bit on her boss, on Sarah, and Sarah felt slighted. And then eventually Sarah was given Isaac, and then at that point she told Abraham, Hagar and Ishmael got to go. So it didn't end happily. Now Carolyn is saying, of course, God heard Hagar. It reminds me of Hagar. So Hagar was sent into the wilderness with Ishmael. And Carolyn says, of course, God heard Hagar and also provided manna during the wilderness wanderings, balancing the ominous with with positivity. Right. So this whole idea, right? The Jews, we have a relationship with the wilderness. When we came out of Egypt, we were in the wilderness for 40 years. In the bosom of the Lord, as it were, he was taking care of us, keeping the sun off our heads with the clouds of glory, feeding us the manna every day, which tasted like whatever your favorite food is. That's what the manna tasted like. And keeping fresh, beautiful, clean spring water coming from the well of Miriam, in the merit of Miriam. So things were good for us in the wilderness, but we know that, well, if God isn't taking care of you directly, then the wilderness is a very scary, desperate, and dangerous place. So we have that, that kind of push-pull, positive-negative relationship with the wilderness. Well worth remembering. So Steve asked the same question I wondered. Why did the sages not bring their wife with them? Of course, right? Why didn't they travel with the wife? Perhaps it just wasn't done. Perhaps it wasn't possible. Perhaps she was needed at home. But it seems like it's not like they were doing this for lewdness, right? They would take this temporary wife in the other town. They wouldn't sleep with her. So it was more like that. It was like a formality, maybe a ceremony that they went through to teach the importance of marriage to the locals. I'm guessing here. I don't have enough background on it, but it's interesting. Bill, think of it from the wife's perspective. Would you want to leave the household you were busy upkeeping to tramp across the land somewhere your husband will have something to do, but you won't? There you go. Good observation, Bill. Okay, are there any other questions? Steve Ribbich. Rabbi Sachs wrote that the Greeks would venerate and make holy that which is beautiful Jews would see that which is holy as being beautiful. Beautiful, perfect, right? Like it's a very exact observation. Thank you for bringing it down from Rabbi Sachs. They absolutely venerated that which is beautiful. They worshiped the human body. They made no bones about it. And those gymnasia, where they would get strong and oil themselves up and gaze on each other and covet not only the possessions of their fellow men, but the men themselves. I mean, the Greeks were, involved in all kinds of stuff. Whereas the Jews, right, we are taught that, that which God says is beautiful, that's what's beautiful. God made nature. It is absolutely beautiful. But what's beautiful about it, right, is that God made it, and God made it for a purpose, and God gave us to understand why the world is here and our place in it, right? I mean, it's so interesting that over time, science has advanced by so many leaps and bounds. I mean, we have such a clearer understanding now of how the sun rises in the morning, right? We understand where we are and how the earth rotates and how the earth revolves around the sun and how the sun revolves around the center of the Milky Way and how the Milky Way is one of these galaxies, among clusters of galaxies, etc. But what science cannot answer is why the sun rises in the morning, why there is a sun in the first place, why we're all here. And that Torah comes to teach us. And when we understand our place in this world and start to ponder on why the world is here, why we're here, and what we can do to contribute to that, then we're on our way toward wisdom. That's what I've got for us today. If you're joining us late, an awful, awful tragedy happened today in Meron in Israel. There was a huge gathering, which is not possible last year, for Lag BaOmer by the tomb of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, a great sage of the Talmud. And they celebrate there and they sing and dance. It's tremendous simcha, time of tremendous joy. And this year, something went wrong with the crowd dynamics and the crowd control, and there was a stampede in one section. People were just suffocating. They were too crushed together. And people, a lot of people were injured. I had heard that before the show began, but during the show, we heard that no, and people in fact died. In fact, 38 people died. So we dedicate our learning today to those neshamas, to those holy souls who had gathered to celebrate our Torah tradition there and our Talmudic tradition there in Meron. And tragedy struck, and so many people were killed in this awful, awful way. And we dedicate our learning to them, and may their neshamas, may their souls have a great elevation in the world to come. Have a good night, my holy sisters and brothers.